World History Discussions, Chapter 5, Part 6. So we're now in the year 771 BCE, and the Zhou dynasty, as you can see in green, has been in power for about 300 years, since 1050 BCE, ruling through subordinates. But in 771 BCE, nomadic peoples, along with dissatisfied allies of the Zhou, invaded China from the west during a rule of a very ineffective king. When the subordinates refused to support the king, the invaders sacked the capital of Hao right there, and they forced the Zhou east to Luoyang. And now it is called the Eastern Zhou dynasty for the next 500 years, from 771 BCE all the way to 256 BCE. This was the moment power had passed from the Zhou kings, and I'm not joking, I told that joke in the last video, to their subordinates. Anyway, the royal court never regained its authority. So that's why I would argue, even though the dates in the book are from 1050 BC to 256 BC, that the real Zhou dynasty was 1050 to 771 BC, because the rest of it is what they call the spring and autumn periods and the Warring States periods. In fact, I'm going to change maps right here. This is kind of what the Warring States period would look like after 403 BC. But I'm going to go back to the original map and talk about why the Zhou dynasty fell after the 771 BCE attack. Because even before this attack, the subordinates had gradually established their own power bases, and they were becoming independent of the Zhou dynasty. Sometimes they'd refuse to pay taxes or military tribute. So remember when I talked about how the Xia and the Shang and the early Zhou, well, especially the Shang and the early Zhou, had monopolized bronze weaponry. Basically, the rulers controlled the production of copper and tin to make bronze, and none of their subordinates or their subjects had access. So, of course, everybody's at the mercy of the kings or the emperor's armies that have all the best bronze weapons around. But now, iron has made it to China. And some people say that China invented iron independently. Others say it came east from the west, places like Anatolia, Turkey, where it was in the Bronze Age collapse around 1200 BC. And so now by 771 BC, it's all the way east in China. But in any case, iron metallurgy really weakened the Zhou and strengthened the subordinates. Because once iron gradually made bronze obsolete, it was cheaper, which meant it was more widely distributed and it could not be monopolized the way bronze had been. And so therefore the subordinates had the same access to iron weapons that the royal Zhou court had, and were a much more effective resistance. And all my NRA fans out there, I'm playing devil's advocate here because I'm not a big guns advocate, but the people that say, oh yeah, we don't want the government to take our guns because then the government has guns and we don't, so the government has total power. Well, that's more or less what happens when the government can't monopolize the weaponry anymore. Iron is in the hands of everybody. It's sort of like give everybody a gun and they can resist their government a lot more easily. And that's what happens right here when the subordinates overtake the Zhou with iron metallurgy. So anyway, then you get from 480 to 221 BCE in this crazy era they call the Warring States period, where territorial princes ignore the Zhou state entirely, and they try to expand their own states while warring ferociously with each other. These are some of the warring states. We're going to talk about the Chu and the Yangtze Valley at the end of this chapter. The Chen is the one that eventually takes over. Notice their location, right by the steppe nomads. That got them nice and strong, fighting the nomads so they could fight to the east and conquer the territory. But anyway, central government would not return until 221 BCE, and the last Zhou king, not joking again, third time I have to make that joke. Anyway, the last one abdicates in 256 BCE. Now I'm giving you a little foreshadowing, because that's the timeline there, 2,000 plus years of ancient Chinese history, and that's where this chapter leaves off. But a little foreshadowing. In this era of the Warring States, you have all this thought going on. You have Taoism, you have Confucianism, and that's around 500 BC. That's chapter 8. And then you have legalism, and that's what the Chen uses, which is basically fascism. And in 221, they reunite China.